Greetings. Welcome to the Vedic Perspective. I'm your host, Ralph Lorino. So we've been examining the lessons from the introduction to the Bhagavad-gita as it is by Srila Prabhupada. We will continue today with the lessons, starting with page 7 is where we left off. So let's continue. Lord Krishna descends specifically to reestablish the real purpose of life when man forgets that purpose. Even then, out of many, many human beings who awaken, there may be one who actually enters the spirit of understanding his position, and for him this Bhagavad-gita is spoken. Actually, we're all followed by the tiger of nescience, but the Lord is very merciful upon the living entities, especially human beings. To this end he spoke the Bhagavad-gita, making his friend Arjuna his student. So, I was thinking that I was moving too fast through the lessons and trying to plow my way through, and that I really wasn't understanding the essence of what is happening here in the introduction. So I decided to take this one line, Lord Krishna descends specifically to reestablish the real purpose of life when man forgets that purpose, and really try to delve in deeply as to the implications, the ramifications of this one line. So from this line of the introduction, we can understand that the Vedic perspective is that the Supreme Lord, externally and internally, is intimately connected with his creation, and that when mankind becomes deviated from the real purpose and mission of human life, that either the Lord himself descends to set things right, or there's a scheduled incarnations that occur at intervals to set things right, and also God is residing in our heart. So the Vedic perspective and the Vedic conception is that God is very near, that God is concerned about his creation, that God intervenes in his creation when things are not going well and people have forgotten the mission and purpose of human life. So my talk today will be an examination of history to try to come to some conclusion about the truth and factual nature of this statement. So the thesis for my talk is that as God, the Supreme Lord, becomes more distant culturally, the economic system becomes more vicious, primarily through usury or loaning money at interest. The more that occurs, the more the society becomes morally degraded. So I'm looking at this from the Vedic perspective. I'm going to use the example of Western culture, how it is we got to this point where we are, how that relates to our conception of God, how that relates to economics, and how that relates to the moral character of the people. I'll give you a brief overview of how European history is looked at. In the enduring scheme for analyzing European history, there's the classical period or antiquity. Plato and Greek philosophy would be a prime example of this. This period goes up to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are usually considered from 500 AD to 1500 AD. And then there's the modern period after 1500 AD. So let's keep in mind the purpose of examining this history. What is the conception of God in these different periods of history? How do they relate to the economic system? And how does that relate to the morality of the people? The early Middle Ages witnessed the rise of monasticism in the West. Monks and monasteries had a deep effect on religious and political life. They were the main and sometimes only outposts of education and literacy in a region. So here we can see that in the Middle Ages, that it was very much a society based on religious principles and religious culture, and that there were monasteries and churches and houses that were the backbone of the culture of that day. Many surviving manuscripts of the Latin classics were copied in monasteries. Monks were also the authors of new works, including history, theology, and other subjects. So for a long time in Western culture, The Middle Ages were referred to as the Dark Ages. Now, this has fallen out of use because there's so much evidence that the Middle Ages were actually a time of a very vibrant intellectual, religious order, that the common people were also concerned about the affairs of religion. They were concerned about understanding God and their position in the world. So, of course, in history, they would call this the Dark Ages to give it a bad name. But actually, the Dark Ages weren't dark. They were actually a time of great intellectual pursuits, of strong religious life, of monasteries being the backbone and the intellectual centers for preserving knowledge, for helping people, for teaching people the values and the ethics that come from religious life. There were healthy movements in the Middle Ages involving philosophy, literature, poetry, medicine. Philosophy and theology fused in scholasticism in an attempt to reconcile authoritative texts, most notably the fusion of Aristotle and the Bible, culminating in the thoughts of St. Thomas Aquinas, who passed away in 1274, and his most famous work is the Summa Theological. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican friar, a Catholic priest, and a doctor of the church. He was the foremost classical proponent of natural theology, of which he argued reason is found in God. Aquinas had great influence on Western thought. Much of modern philosophy is based on his ideas or a reaction to his ideas of ethics, natural law, metaphysics, and political theory. So the Middle Ages it's producing great thinkers, and primarily what they're thinking about is how to reconcile the different classical or the classical Greek thought with the Bible and how these two relate. Primarily in the area of reason. So we know in the Gospel of St. John that the first line is, in the beginning there was the Word. So the actual meaning of word in Greek they use is logos, and arche enho logos. That is the Greek version in the original of the first line of the Gospel of St. John. So logos is a very interesting term. It refers to more than just the word. It refers to language. It refers to reason. It refers to the order of the universe. So it's a very, very important. Of course, in the Vedic perspective, we also have the conception that the creation is coming from sound vibration or the word. And within the word, there's so many different aspects that we can examine and that we can study. So we can see that there's a great correlation there between the Vedic texts and the early Christian thinkers. So let's look at some architecture of that era. From the 12th century, French builders developed the Gothic style of architecture. That's rib vaults, pointed arches, flying buttresses, large stained glass windows used mainly in churches and cathedrals. And this continued to the 16th century in much of Europe. Chartres Cathedral, Reims Cathedral, Salisbury Cathedral are primary examples of this style of architecture. So we can see not only in the thought of the people of the time, both the intellectual and religious class and the foremost thinkers, but also the common people through churches and monasteries, where also their life was very much influenced and involved with religious life. And the conception of God was that God was near, and this is reflected in the thought of the time and also in the architecture of the time. Now, one very interesting aspect of this is the poet Dante. Dante increased literature in vernacular language. That means now literature would be available to even the common man in their common language. It wouldn't be written exclusively in Latin. And Dante is really one of the main people that bring this to the forefront in his poem, The Divine Comedy. Dante passed away in 1321. So during this time, much literature remained religious in character. New demand for the lives of saints and other devotional works in vernacular rather than Latin. So this is coming from the common people. Because the conception of God was that God was near, that God was involved in their lives, that the purpose and mission of their lives was to understand their relationship with God, there was a demand in the increase of literature written in language that they could understand to increase their understanding of the saints and devotional life. So Dante Alighieri, he lived from 1265 to 1321. He was an Italian poet during the late Middle Ages. His Divine Comedy is widely considered the most important poem of the Middle Ages and the greatest literary work in the Italian language. The Divine Comedy describes Dante's travels through hell, purgatory, and paradise or heaven. It draws on Christian theology and philosophy, especially that of Thomas Aquinas. So we see that the great thinkers of the time is now being reflected in the great literature of the time. It's being reflected in the architecture of the time. It's being reflected in the aspirations of even the common man. So I think at this point we can examine what is the state of the economic situation, especially in terms of usury or loaning money at interest during this time period of the Middle Ages. And I think the best way to do that is to look at Dante's poem, The Divine Comedy, especially the part called Inferno, or as Dante and Virgil explore and move through the different levels of hell. So in the Inferno, cantos 12 through 17, the seventh circle of hell is described. Virgil explains to Dante that the sins of violence take three forms according to the victim. One form of violence is against other people, one's neighbor. Another form of violence is against oneself. And another form of violence is against God. Violence against other people or property, those are murderers or bandits, are punished in the first ring of the seventh circle of hell, a river of blood. Violence against themselves or their own property, suicides or squanderers, that's the second ring of the seventh circle of hell. And it's a horrid forest. The third ring, inside the first two, is a barren plain of sand ignited by flakes of fire that torment three separate groups of violent offenders against God. So this is considered to be even more worse than murder or suicide. So on the inner circle, the inner ring of the seventh circle of hell, according to Dante's Inferno, first is those who offended God directly, blasphemers, those who violate nature, God's offspring, the sodomites, and the third is those who harm industry and the economy, the offspring of nature, therefore God's grandchildren, the usurers. So in this conception, in this ring of hell, even considered worse than murderers, worse than people that commit suicide, worse than blasphemers, are usurers, or people that are taking advantage of ordinary common people through the economic system. Dante's emotional reaction to the seventh circle ranged from neutral observation of the murderers, compassion for the suicide victims, respect for several Florentine sodomites, revulsion, but his most visceral reaction is a revulsion against the sight and behavior of the lewd usurers. Dante's treatment of usurers is consistent with how usury was condemned at the time. So we can see that when the conception of God was very much near to people, that it was reflected in thought, art, architecture, culture, that there was almost a universal condemnation of usury at the time, and that the economic system was primarily based on labor, or that the creation of man, what man could create. I have one quote here from the Bible, from Jesus, to kind of give some kind of theological background to this. Jesus appeals to his followers to lend, expecting nothing in return. That's Luke 6:35. So Jesus is asking people to not take advantage of other people, uh, and this would extend to all fields of life, including the economy. St. Thomas Aquinas considered usury to be unnatural because it is in accordance with nature, the money from increase from natural goods and not from money itself. So Aquinas felt that by the exchange of real goods and services, that would be the basis of a healthy economy, but that money coming from money is unnatural. So to sum it up, here in the Middle Ages, the conception of God is very strong, that it's reflected in many aspects of human life, and the economic system is also reflecting a more kind type of outlook where the powerful have less of an opportunity to take advantage of the weak based on moral law. So in the past, it's fallen out of use now. This Middle Ages was often called the Dark Ages, which is obviously propaganda. The time when God was near people, when their thoughts, their architecture, their lives were centered around God, when the greatest literature of the time, especially in Dante's Divine Comedy, are being produced. They're calling this the Dark Ages. All right, so we have to be careful when we look at history that there's a lot of mind control and propaganda going on. So let's move to the Renaissance. Now, again, perhaps that we'll have to say the Renaissance, it has a lot of connotations to that word, has connotations to it. So let's see if it really was a Renaissance. This is a period in European history covering the span between 1500 and 1700. It marked a transition between the Middle Ages and the modern times. The intellectual basis of the Renaissance was its own invented version of humanism, derived from the concept of Roman humanities and the rediscovery of classical Greek philosophy, such as that of Protagoras, who said, "Man is the measure of all things." This new thinking became manifest in art, architecture, politics, science, and literature. So here we could say, if anything described the Middle Ages, it was that God is the measure of all things. So now we're moving into the so-called Renaissance, which is actually not a Renaissance. It is actually a degradation. And their main, what you could say, motto of the time is man is the measure of all things. So we can see that progressively now God is moving away from man's thoughts, from his intellectual understandings, and this is going to be reflected in all areas of life, including art, architecture, politics, science, and literature. So let's explore a little bit how this happened, how man started to move away from the conception, the Vedic conception, that God is near. The Renaissance began in Florence, Italy. Neoplatonic infection began with Cosimo de' Medici. He passed away in 1464. Italian bankers and politicians were the first members of the Medici political dynasty. They served as the de facto rulers of Florence, the de Medicis, throughout the Renaissance. Its power derived from his wealth as a banker, patron of learning, art, and architecture. In 1415, Cosimo accompanied Antipope John XXIII to the Council of Constance. In 1410, Cosimo's father Giovanni lent John XXIII, then known as Baldassare Cosa, to buy himself the office of cardinal, which he repaid by making the Medici Bank head of all papal finances once he claimed the papacy. This gave the Medicis tremendous power, allowing them to threaten defaulting debtors with excommunication. So here we see through the Medicis that there's becoming a fusion, almost like a corporate fusion between merchants, bankers, and the Pope, or the religious leaders of the time. So this is really when the leadership is starting to fail as far as keeping God close to the people. And this is where the corruption starts to enter into religious life, especially in the leadership. The whole anti-pope thing is about the schism between the Catholic Church, between the Orthodox Catholic Church and the papacy from Rome. So they had different councils to try to bridge this schism, which ultimately were not successful. And sometimes there would be an Orthodox pope from the Orthodox line. Sometimes there would be a pope from the Catholic line. And this was kind of like the clashing at the time. And there's now become a schism in religious life. And the schism is always going to be weakening religious life. And this allows different philosophies, different ways of thought, different economic systems, different political systems that are more corrupt to enter into it. As we see that John the 23rd, through the Medicis, bought the office of cardinal. And then when he became pope, he appointed the Medicis as the papal bankers, so that gave them tremendous power. So we see here the fusion of these corrupted elements coming together and making God is not the center anymore. The center is becoming profit, power, etc. Okay, so here we see the merging of the papacy with financial, corporate, banking interests. Pope Pius II said of Cosimo, "Political questions are settled in Cosimo's house. The man he chooses to hold office, it is he, Cosimo, who decides peace and war. He is king in all but name." So we see actually the power is shifting from the religious leaders of the time to the secular leaders of the time, especially in the sense that the Medicis were bankers, and certainly loaning money at interest was something that they would be involved with. Here we see banking and corporate interests controlling the affairs of state from behind the scenes. And this too is important, that now we certainly have the idea that the people that they put in front of us as politicians aren't ultimately controlling the situation. It's probably some conglomeration of corporate leaders, military generals, and banking interests that are really controlling what happens, and that the politicians, that's more or less a dog and pony show for the common man to keep them believing, oh yes, we have some say and our vote counts. But you have to think that people with billion and trillion dollar interests, such as corporate interests, such as military interests, such as banking interests, are not going to let someone new come in every 4 years and tinker with the whole thing. And if they tinker too much, if they do come in and try to tinker too much with the system, their life is in danger. So, of course, so much is based on philosophy. Nowadays, people aren't that interested in philosophy. But let's see how what is called the Neoplatonic infection comes into the Renaissance and starts to destroy religious institutions and religious thought. So Cosimo hosts the Council of Florence. This took place from 1438 to 1439. It was an attempt to reconcile the East-West schism that had taken place in the Catholic Church, which is now the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. It is at this council that Georgius Gemistus, who passed away in 1453, he was later called Platon. He reintroduces Plato's ideas to the Western Europe. Here, Platon meets and influences Cosimo to found a new Platonic academy in Florence under Marsilio Ficino, who would proceed to translate into Latin all Plato's works. As revealed in Platon's last book, the Book of Laws, which he only circulated amongst his close friends, he rejected Christianity in favor of return to worship of ancient Hellenic gods. So this person, Platon, became extremely influential as one of the main thinkers of the time. Also, Cosimo de' Medici, he would be highly motivated to start to secularize religion so that the restraints on banking would become less and less. So Platon is promoted. They develop a Neoplatonic school, which is now moving away from the idea of the Supreme Lord and rather going back to the Hellenistic gods. So this is happened in Florence at a council where it was supposed to be about unifying, but now we see that this other element, because of the schism, has weakened everyone, and that there are nefarious forces now coming to control the Catholic Church and the papacy in terms of banking, that this gives the opening for a philosophy to come in that will further weaken the conception of God culturally. Here we see the dividing point between intellectual and religious thought in the Renaissance, the Pope now becoming the pawn of bankers and merchant interests. Platon may also have been the source for Ficino's Orphic system of natural magic. So now we're getting into even more about what is the result of this type of thinking that Platon introduced as far as the Neoplatonic. It starts to become magic. Here we see the reintroduction of natural magic. This is in the forms of astrology and alchemy. The East-West schism in the Church, Catholic versus Orthodox, now add an intellectual schism to Neoplatonism, natural magic, and then that ultimately evolves into ceremonial magic. So in the Renaissance, Neoplatonism of Marsilio Ficino ultimately also influences John Dee, who passed away in 1608. Dee did not draw a distinction between his mathematical research and his investigations into Hermetic magic, angel summoning, and divination. He was an advocate of English imperialistic expansion into a British empire. So coming from the Neoplatonism that started to infect the church, that became an interest in natural and ceremonial magic. And this influenced a lot of the thinkers of the time. Someone like John Dee basically was in control of England because of his influence over the monarchs at the time. So now we see this. This is further stepping away from what we would call some kind of bona fide authoritative disciplic succession. That now we have people investigating areas of research which can be described as, demonic in a way, that they're trying to summon demons, they're trying to look into the future in their own imperfect way rather than taking it from an authorized scripture, let's say for the scheduled incarnations, what is going to be happening in the future. So this is a huge problem, the Neoplatonic influence that comes in during the schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Ultimately, this type of thought leads to Isaac Newton, it's really amazing how people don't know that much about Isaac Newton, but he was really the last of the alchemists. His research was primarily in alchemy. He was trying to create the philosopher's stone. He believed that the Greek myths, taken in a certain way, again, Neoplatonic, they were actually chemical formulas, and that if you followed the Greek mythology the whole way through, using them as chemical reactions in an alchemical way, that ultimately you would come with the philosopher's stone, which could grant immortal life, which could turn base metals into gold, that kind of thing. That was really the main thrust of Newton's research. Also, a lot of people don't know about Isaac Newton was that he was what you would call a religious fanatic, in a sense, that his main purpose was that he was delving into Christian scripture to try to understand the future, when the apocalypse would come. Anyway, those were actually his two main areas of research, were scripture and alchemy. And the whole thing of him being some kind of rational scientist and the founder of all these rational scientific thought, people should investigate who the founder is of that whole thing, because he had a lot of other stuff going on. Anyway, Newton's life spanned from 1642 to 1726. Newton completes the return to a pre-Christian paganism through cosmology. For example, his theory of gravity is taken from Empedocles. Empedocles, his theory was love and strife. There are two main forces in the universe. There's love and there's strife. And the tension between these two create a perfect situation where the universe is in balance. That the forces of love and strife create perfect balance. Newton then renamed this as gravity and inertia. And the gravity and inertia are now creating perfect balance in the universe and perfect circular motion of the planets, etc., etc. So this is actually going back to the time of Plato, and the Greek thinkers of that time is actually where the theory of gravity comes from. All right. So, also during the Renaissance, we have another problem, which is the Reformation. This is a period in the Renaissance that goes from 1517 to 1648. While this schism for religious intellectual thought is going on, there is also a fracturing of Christianity through the Reformation. The Reformation destroyed the unity of faith and ecclesiastical organization of the Christian peoples of Europe, robbed them of the greatest portion of the cultivation and maintenance of supernatural life. The false fundamental doctrine of justification by faith alone produced a lamentable shallowness in religious life. Zeal for good works and charity also disappeared. Supernatural interest fell into the background, and naturalistic aspirations aiming at the purely mundane became widespread. This gave rise to endless divisions into sects and never-ending disputes. This led to the secular authorities as supreme even in religious matters. This was the chief factor in the evolution of royal absolutism. It occasioned civil wars, people were suppressed and enslaved, countless treasures of art and priceless manuscripts were destroyed. This was accomplished with the sanction of the Reformation leaders by the looting of the Benedictine, Cistercian, and Celestine monasteries and houses and universities where 1,000 years of stored wealth were housed. This storehouse of wealth was transferred to the monarchs and aristocracy, which increased their stranglehold over all the citizens. This was especially true in England under King Henry VIII. So this is not very well known. I mean, whatever good intentions the Reformation may have started with, as far as a philosophical movement, basically what it became was a looting operation of the stored wealth of the Catholic monasteries, churches, houses, and universities of the time. And that wealth, and I think that people would be shocked to read that some of the main players in the Reformation, such as Martin Luther and others, they condoned the looting of these churches. They condoned the looting of the monasteries. So, because they had a quarrel with the leadership of the Catholic Church, I don't believe that gave them the right to steal the properties that were actually helping people in terms of they were intellectual centers, they were hospitals for the sick. Also, the lands of the monasteries and churches were used by the common people for agricultural purposes. And then the looting of the monasteries and churches, that money did not go to the ordinary common man, especially in England. It was completely usurped by the monarchs of the time to increase their power. And the people that did the looting were then called knights. So it was a very serious matter. It was the destruction of culture. It was destruction of knowledge. It was the destruction of centers where people could feel close to God, to get an understanding of God. And it was a further schism, first you had the schism between the East and the West as far as Catholic versus Orthodox. That weakness allowed the Neoplatonic view of the world through magic to influence science and other arts. And now we have a further fracturing of Christianity, despite whatever good intentions that it was started with, now is going to create war civil war amongst populations, which only increases the need for loans at interest to finance the wars, etc. It left the citizens without its main social support structure, which was the monasteries and houses that had been used for the good of the people. So the bankers, starting with the Medicis, needed to secularize society in order to loan money, therefore making a profit off the interest on loans. Because of the rise of secularism, merchant class, aristocrats flush with plundered wealth, usury explodes during the Renaissance. Although the common people and the religious and many of the religious and intellectual people of the time still regard usury with skepticism, so there's still, at least externally, in religious leaders, in intellectual leaders, and in the common people, some resistance to the idea of usury during the Renaissance. But externally, what's really happening is, through the stolen wealth of the Catholic monasteries, the aristocrats become flush with money that they are now loaning at interest to finance war and for their own extravagant lifestyles. And this further solidifies their corrupted power. All right, so now we move to the Enlightenment, which is 1685 to 1815. The Enlightenment was marked by the emphasis on the scientific method and reductionism, along with increased questioning of religious orthodoxy. So the main, you could say, motto of the Enlightenment is now dare to know. In other words, we don't accept any knowledge that's coming down through authoritative religious sources. That the Renaissance has really weakened that concept, and now man is going to try to start on his own to try to understand what's going on around him without any guidance from authority, especially religious authority. The Enlightenment thinkers typically denounce supernatural occurrences as mere superstition. When we say supernatural in these concepts, we mean like transcendental, something metaphysical, something beyond the physical, metaphysical, transcendent. You could call them supernatural. The Enlightenment spurred atheism. It also resulted in a mix between Christianity and scientific rationalism. This is illustrated best by the deist movement that gripped Europe and the U.S. during the late 18th century. So this was also seen by many of the founding fathers, especially well known that Thomas Jefferson was a deist. Deism is the belief that God exists, but chooses to let the universe proceed according to natural law. Deists deny supernatural or transcendental or metaphysical occurrences, and that God is knowable through reason and nature, not divine revelation. We could call this divine revelation almost as a disciplic succession, where the knowledge is passed down. God is the great clockmaker who created the world like a clock and then allows it to run according to natural operation, without supernatural intervention. Many of America's founding fathers were deists, as I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson being the most well-known. So we could see that this is really becoming, God is really moving into the background now. Man is taking center stage. He doesn't really even believe, a lot of people aren't even believing in God anymore. What they are believing in somehow is the power of man, even though there are so many faults that we know of when, that there are our tendency to make mistakes. Our senses are imperfect. There's a tendency to cheat and to cheat others. So there's no more influence, there's no more direction from authoritative religious sources, and that it's actually being considered to be some kind of something that's not even wanted anymore. And then there's this whole deist movement, which is kind of like a bridge between atheism, that God just creates the universe, and then he just sits back and lets it operate. So it's the exact opposite of the Vedic perspective, that God is intimately connected with his creation, that he's watching over his creation, that he intervenes in his creation, that God is in the heart of every living entity, help to give direction as to what is to be done and what is not to be done. So this is really, really starting to move culturally the Supreme Lord into the background, religious authorities into the background, religious scriptures into the background. This culminates in the last stage of usury. So what is the effect of the Enlightenment on the economic policies? We can look at the example of Adam Smith. He's considered to be one of the most important, I guess you could say, economists of the time as far as British empiricism goes. He then continues the line that Isaac Newton followed, and he removes the moral philosophy and moral law from economics. And he says that just as Newton, Empedocles had love and strife, creating perfect balance, Newton had gravity and inertia, creating perfect balance. Now in economics, it's going to be viewed almost like as a physics without any morality. And his idea is that self-interest and competition will create this perfect balance. And so there's no need for moral philosophy or moral interjection any longer in economic systems. So he divorces the economic policy from moral philosophy. His book, The Wealth of Nations, this is where he proposes the laissez-faire economics, which is no intervention, thereby opening the door for the powerful to take advantage of the weak. So this is always what happens when there's no moral law, is that the powerful start to take advantage of the weak when there's no restraint. This opens the door to the final stage of usury, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, because by debt, monetary system concentrates wealth into fewer and fewer hands. Okay, so this did not go unchallenged, this idea of Adam Smith, that competition versus self-interest would create perfect balance in the economy. This reaction came by the German idealist led by Johann Fichte. He passed away in 1814. In contrast to the usurious system of the British empiricists, the German idealist economic philosophy is that labor is the source of all value. The German idealist philosophy of economics ultimately leads in Germany to a vibrant economy which surpasses Britain in economic power in 1910. So this is a system where they were trying to get back to more of what you would call a reasonable, in other words, they injected moral philosophy and moral law back into economics. They were trying to inject it back into economics instead of being debt-centered, usurious, loan-centered, greed-centered, profit-centered, with no moral oversight. The German idealists, they put the worker, the laborer back in the center. So their thought was that by having high wages, by creating great craftsmen, that created amazing products, that this would, then they would trade, so that their products would be in high demand because they're of high quality, created by great craftsmen. They paid these craftsmen high wages. These craftsmen would then have enough money to start families. So when you start a family, you need so many things, houses and transportation and things for the children, et cetera, that the high wages of the workers are then put back into the economy, creating a very vibrant economy. Also, you don't need a big military because you get what you want from other countries by trade, rather than the British empiricist model, which is you take what you want, you take over the country, you need a big military spending on that. You need a huge navy, you need all kinds of expenditure for setting up in the new countries that you're taking over. So this was the reaction, and the Germans were winning. And by 1910, they had surpassed British Empire in terms of their economic power. So this is the actual cause of the two world wars. It was German economic superiority based on a system of economics based on labor, rather than a system of economics which was the British Empire based on usury. So the Britons knew that the Germans had taken over world trade. They didn't like it. They didn't want to lose their hegemonic position. And so there was the First World War, was to destroy Germany in terms of their economic power. And then to finish them off, there was World War II. So many millions of people had to die to protect an economic system based on usury, where God is put into the background, and that there's no more moral law. When there's no more moral law, then war is feasible. Killing millions of people unnecessarily to protect your interests becomes feasible. So, the two world wars were waged against Germany to destroy its labor-based, powerful economy, which begins to dominate world trade. With the defeat and destruction of German economic power, America inherits the mantle of the Anglo Empire with its debt-based usurious system divorced from moral law, ultimately leading to the devaluation of labor and the out-of-control usury and debt we see today, with its concomitant destruction of the family by destroying the wages of the workers, by the devaluation of labor. So by the devaluation of labor, then people can no longer have strong families, because now the woman has to work, that families are smaller, that now God has receded into the background. So you're harassed on so many sides in the current system that we have today. So I think that in this talk I've proven my thesis. As God and his servants become more distant culturally, economic policies become amoral and vicious, thereby leading to a hedonistic populace. So my main point was that the Vedic perspective is deep and has a lot of deep knowledge. And just by taking this one line, that Lord Krishna descends specifically to reestablish the real purpose of life when man forgets that purpose, that we can understand so many facets of human life based on this, that as God recedes into the background, what are the actual ramifications? It also really puts into doubt the atheistic position. If you ask them, well, where does your morality come from if you don't believe in any kind of religious system? Again, just like as we've discussed with the teacher coming from inside, that actually morality doesn't come from within inside, that you can't know all the subtleties, because you'll see many atheists are big capitalists, which basically means nowadays what is called capitalism is basically just state-sponsored usury. It's a usurious system protected by the government. So the subtleties of morality cannot be understood from within. So this is not right to say. And really, when you're an atheist, you have to basically adopt the ethics of the oligarchs, because you're going by the law. You have to go by whatever the law of the state is. So yeah, there's some things that are obvious, like no, you shouldn't murder, and you shouldn't steal. But then, as it becomes more subtle in the field of economic policy, then people, that's too subtle to really come from an understanding within inside of you. And so we see what that leads to now. People believe in abortion, even post-birth abortion, evidently. I don't know what's going on exactly. So the atheist really, he's taking his moral cues from the oligarchs, who are essentially immoral, and that he basically believes whatever they believe. So the atheist is the useful tool of the oligarchs to help destroy religion and the strength of religion and the strength of labor and the strength of the populace. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening today, and I hope you got some new light. And I think that this is a type of proof for the existence of God, that when we keep God in the center, when we keep him near, that puts a brake on the powerful taking advantage of the weak. And throughout history, when we see through the Middle Ages was strong, The Renaissance started to erode the place of God culturally in our lives. We see a simultaneous erosion of the economic system, favoring the powerful over the weak, creating wars, creating theft, no matter under what so-called philosophical guise. Then we get to the Enlightenment, where God is further divorced from man. Now man is trying to take center stage with all of his flaws and faults. And Deism as the bridge, which is basically the religion of the founding fathers, how this creates an economic system ultimately that is completely divorced from moral philosophy and moral law. And that leads us to the show that we have today, where, you know, as far as Western culture goes, it is probably the most degraded culture in the history of mankind, or one of the most degraded cultures in the history of mankind. That the atheist really has no answer when it comes to these subtleties of morality, and that we need God, we need the incarnations of God, we need the acharyas and the great saints and sages to keep us on the right path, so that there is an equitable distribution and a happy life for the majority of the people. So I thank you for listening, and we'll talk next time on the Vedic perspective. Thank you.